They laughed at her accent, sneered at her gown, and thought she was beneath them. Minutes later, she canceled their $1B deal in front of the entire ballroom. The chandeliers burned with a golden light that poured over the marble ballroom, a glow so rich it seemed to erase shadows and replace them with shimmer. The Harrington family's annual charity gala was not just an event. It was a performance staged to remind the city who still held power in a world where fortunes rose and fell overnight. Waiters in white gloves floated through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne flutes that caught the light like liquid fire, while a string quartet played soft music that laced through the conversations of senators, heirs, bankers, and celebrities who had come to bask in the Harrington aura. The ballroom was a monument to their wealth, with towering arrangements of roses on every table, crystal vases that seemed too delicate to touch, and a floor polished so bright that the reflections of diamonds and sequins danced with every step. Charles Harrington stood near the center, silver hair shining under the lights, his tuxedo pressed as if it had been poured onto him, greeting guests with the confidence of a man who knew his name was carved into the city's skyline. Beside him was Eleanor, statuesque in a gown the color of midnight, her jewels chosen not to sparkle but to gleam with restrained dominance, as if to remind those around her that old money did not need to shout. Their children flanked them, Edward with his tailored smirk, and Vivian with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass, both moving with the restless confidence of heirs who had never known hunger or fear. They accepted compliments with smiles that never reached their eyes, measuring each guest not by their words but by the worth of their networks. Everywhere, conversations hummed with carefully constructed charm, deals hinted at in whispers between toasts, laughter practiced and polished. It was a world where appearances mattered more than truths, where gowns and cufflinks were signals in a language spoken fluently by those born into wealth. The Harrington Gala was always the pinnacle of the season, the place where power gathered not in boardrooms but beneath chandeliers and candlelight. Tonight, however, the stage was set for something no one expected: a fracture in the marble, a change in the air. By the grand staircase, new arrivals were announced by name and title, applause rippling like a tide as each important figure entered the golden room. The orchestra swelled gently, champagne glasses chimed, and the hum of wealth seemed eternal. But behind the shine, beneath the roses and the polished marble, the evening carried a tension no one yet noticed. A shift was waiting, quiet as the pause before a storm. The Harringtons believed they were hosting another flawless performance, another night to display their legacy and remind the city that theirs was the name whispered with reverence and envy. Yet as the music floated and the chandeliers gleamed, the crowd remained unaware that among them walked a guest whose presence would turn laughter into silence, whose composure would make arrogance tremble, and whose decision before the night was over would erase $1 billion with nothing more than a quiet, steady voice. The doors of the ballroom opened once more, and the flow of light from the chandeliers spilled across a figure who did not belong to this world, yet carried herself as if she had been born to it. Amara Johnson stepped into the Harrington Gala with a calm that came not from entitlement, but from hard-earned composure, the kind shaped by years of proving herself in rooms that doubted her before she had even spoken. At 32, she was younger than many of the tycoons gathered here, yet the emerald gown she wore held a quiet authority that silenced the instinct to underestimate her. The gown was simple compared to the extravagant sequins and feathers around her, its lines clean and classic, but on her it glowed with elegance, the fabric moving with her like water under moonlight. Her hair was gathered neatly, her jewelry understated, each detail chosen not to shout, but to remind the room that true power never needed to beg for attention. Eyes followed her as she crossed the marble floor, some curious, some doubtful, some sharp with envy. In a world where lineage and legacy were currency, Amara was the anomaly, the outsider, a woman whose name was not carved into the city's old marble plaques but printed in the latest headlines of business journals. She had grown up in Detroit, in a small house that trembled with every passing train, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at the hospital and a grandmother who told her that dignity was not a gift but a discipline. From there she had carved a path no one believed possible. First scholarships, then late nights in borrowed libraries. Finally, the leap that built her company from a single rented office with peeling paint into a renewable energy empire that stretched across 3 continents. Her company's turbines spun in deserts and valleys, her solar panels covered rooftops from Lagos to Los Angeles, and her innovations had caught the eye of governments and billionaires alike. Tonight she was not simply a guest in a borrowed emerald gown, she was the quiet fulcrum of a deal worth $1 billion, a partnership that could expand her vision and give the Harrington family a much-needed foothold in the future of clean power. Yet the irony was that almost no one in the room knew it. To them she was another name on the guest list, an elegant curiosity, a woman who walked with grace but carried no visible crown of legacy. Only Charles Harrington and a handful of his board members were aware that she held the pen that could sign or sever their most ambitious project. Amara felt the weight of their glances, but met none of them with hesitation. She paused at the edge of the crowd, allowing herself a moment to absorb the glittering spectacle, the crystal vases, the polished marble, the endless whirl of silk and champagne. She breathed in the air of wealth that carried both admiration and arrogance. And then she smiled, a small, unshaken smile, because she knew what they did not. Beneath the chandeliers, among the gilded voices, she was not the outsider they assumed. She was the center of the story yet to be written. The Harrington family moved through the ballroom like royalty at court, their presence carefully staged and rehearsed, until it seemed natural. Charles Harrington led the way, his tuxedo cut to perfection, his silver hair gleaming beneath the chandeliers, his handshake firm and confident, his laugh deep and practiced. Every step he took seemed to draw the eyes of those nearby, for Charles had spent decades building a reputation as the kind of man who made or broke fortunes with a nod. He carried himself as if he owned not just the building but the city itself, a patriarch whose empire stretched from real estate to finance, each acquisition a jewel in the family crown. He enjoyed the attention the way a man enjoys a favorite vintage, letting it roll over him, savoring the way people leaned closer when he spoke. At his side was Eleanor, her midnight gown catching the golden light of the chandeliers with every turn of her wrist. She was tall, elegant, her diamonds chosen not to glitter but to gleam with quiet superiority, a reminder that old money had nothing to prove. Her smile was smooth and sharp at once, a weapon she used to flatter or dismiss, depending on the worth of the person standing before her. She had mastered the art of small talk that sounded warm while leaving nothing of substance behind, her words floating like perfume, sweet but fading quickly. Guests leaned into her orbit, eager for her approval, and she gave it sparingly, as if her attention were a currency more valuable than any donation check. Behind them followed Edward and Vivienne, the heirs, perfectly dressed, perfectly bored. Edward's tuxedo was a mirror of his father's, though his smirk betrayed less discipline and more arrogance. He moved through the crowd with a drink in hand, offering shallow compliments that never rose above the surface. His eyes lingered too long on the women he passed, his words too quick to dismiss the men who were not useful to him. Vivienne, wrapped in silk the shade of pale champagne, tilted her chin in the practiced angle of disdain. She had been raised to believe she was the most beautiful woman in the room, and her gaze searched constantly for threats to that title. Her compliments to other women were edged with insult, her laughter calculated to rise and fall at just the right moment. Together they were the future of the Harrington name, though it was a future built on appearance rather than substance. Around them the Gala swirled with music and money, champagne and whispered deals, yet the Harringtons stood apart. They were a spectacle, gliding across marble as if their feet never touched it, smiling as if the world were a stage built only for them. Their empire was not one of factories or fields, but of perception, of polished surfaces and photographs in society magazines. Every nod, every smile, every gesture was part of the performance. What the crowd did not see, or chose not to see, was how fragile such performances could be. Tonight, beneath chandeliers and roses, the Harringtons were flawless. But perfection in a world of masks is only ever one breath away from collapse. Amara stepped deeper into the ballroom, the marble beneath her heels, echoing softly, as if marking each stride with quiet intention. The crowd shifted around her in ripples, not in welcome but in curiosity, their gazes brushing against her emerald gown like invisible fingers. Conversations slowed when she passed, glasses paused halfway to lips, and whispers stirred in her wake. Some recognized her from the business pages, the young CEO who had risen with startling speed, a woman who had built a renewable energy company that now stretched across continents. To them, she was a visionary, a sign that the world was changing, a reminder that innovation was no longer the private garden of old families and inherited wealth. Yet others looked at her and saw only an outsider, a figure who did not belong beneath crystal chandeliers and painted ceilings, someone who had crossed into a realm that was not meant for her. Her emerald gown seemed almost too simple in a sea of sequins and feathers, yet its simplicity was its strength. Where others sparkled, she glowed, the fabric catching the light with quiet grace, her posture commanding without being loud. The whispers did not touch her composure, though she could hear them as clearly as if they had been spoken into her ear. She has no pedigree, they said. She is new money, she is lucky, she will not last. But she walked on, each step measured, her expression serene, her eyes steady on the horizon of the room. The Harrington family's circle was not far, a polished cluster of wealth and power around which the Gala orbited. Amara felt the pull of their presence, but did not rush to meet it. Instead, she let her gaze sweep across the guests, noting the subtle glances, the stiff smiles, the envy wrapped in admiration. She had spent her life walking into rooms that doubted her, and tonight was no different. The air was perfumed with roses and champagne, but beneath it, she could smell the faint sting of judgment, as sharp as smoke after a fire. She had learned long ago not to flinch, not to let them see even a flicker of doubt. As she accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, her reflection in the golden liquid reminded her of where she had come from. The cramped apartment in Detroit, the late nights studying by lamplight, the weight of bills her mother could never quite pay, the promise she made to herself that she would one day stand in rooms like this, not as a guest, but as an equal. That promise had carried her through rejection and ridicule, through failures that nearly broke her, through triumphs that built her company into an empire of clean energy. And now here she was, walking among marble pillars and velvet curtains, not as a charity case or a token presence, but as the potential partner in a deal worth $1 billion. The whispers grew, but Amara let them pass through her like wind through trees. She knew who she was, and she knew what she carried. In a room built on legacy, she was the future, and the future had just walked in. Charles Harrington spotted Amara across the ballroom, and his expression shifted into the kind of smile that had won over senators and mayors for decades, polished but never quite sincere. He moved toward her with the ease of a man used to commanding attention, his tuxedo gleaming under the chandeliers, his hand extended as if welcoming her into a kingdom that belonged only to him. Amara accepted his greeting with calm grace, her fingers steady, her eyes unflinching. He praised her company in vague terms, describing it as promising, a word that implied potential, but not accomplishment, a word he used for ambitious interns rather than partners in billion-dollar ventures. He then guided her toward his family, his hand resting lightly at her back in a gesture that was meant to seem kind, but carried the weight of possession. Edward Harrington stood with his glass of scotch, his posture loose, his smirk sharp as he looked Amara over. He extended his hand, but not fully, as if daring her to take the effort to reach him, and when she did, he chuckled under his breath, making a small remark about her surprising confidence. It was not praise but a barb, framed as observation, and his eyes glinted with the satisfaction of a man who believed his power untouchable. Beside him stood Vivienne, her gown glittering in shades of champagne, her smile wide but brittle, the kind that cracked at the edges if held too long. She leaned forward to kiss the air near Amara's cheek, her perfume strong, her words smooth, complimenting the emerald gown, but in a tone that suggested it was nearly right, not quite right. Something that could be improved with better taste and better guidance. Eleanor Harrington, towering and poised in her midnight gown, regarded Amara with an expression that carried the weight of generations. Her eyebrow lifted ever so slightly, a motion sharper than words, and her voice flowed like chilled wine as she remarked that it was refreshing to see new faces at the gala, though of course not everyone could be expected to understand the traditions of such an event. Her tone was flawless, her smile smooth, but the message was clear. She was drawing a line between belonging and intrusion, between the heirs of old money and the woman who had carved her own path into their marble hall. The air seemed to thicken around them as the exchange settled, polite words floating like polished glass, their edges sharp beneath the surface. Amara listened without interruption, her posture tall, her expression calm, her eyes steady, as each subtle insult slid toward her like cards dealt in a rigged game. She had been here before in other forms, in boardrooms where her voice was questioned, in meetings where her ideas were repeated back to her as if they were not hers, in dinners where her presence was tolerated but never fully welcomed. She let Charles continue, his tone heavy with ownership as he spoke of the possibility of collaboration, framing it as though he were offering her a seat she had not already earned. She nodded at each remark, not with submission but with patience, knowing that power often revealed itself in tone more than words. Around them the music continued, champagne glasses chimed, and the night glittered on, but in that moment, the Harrington family showed her exactly who they were. The dinner was laid out with all the extravagance the Harrington name could command. A long table of polished mahogany gleaming under the crystal chandeliers, silverware lined in precise order, crystal glasses glowing with deep red wine. Around it sat senators, bankers, heirs, and polished socialites, each one chosen not only for their wealth but for their ability to enhance the image of the family hosting them. Amara sat among them, her emerald gown catching the soft light, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table, her presence quiet but commanding. She was placed near Charles at the head, though not at his side, a subtle signal that she was both important and yet not one of them, welcome and yet distant. The conversation swirled around her in layers of practiced charm, laughter that rose a little too high, compliments that rang hollow, and the delicate dance of people who spoke in code about money and influence. Edward leaned back in his chair, glass of wine tilting lazily in his hand, his smirk deepening as his eyes fixed on Amara. He asked her where she grew up, his tone curious on the surface but edged with something sharper. When she replied that she was from Detroit, his grin widened, and he repeated the word with exaggerated vowels, dragging it out until the syllables sounded coarse and ugly. He then imitated her cadence, twisting it into a caricature, a cruel echo meant to turn her story into a punchline. For a moment the table hesitated, but then laughter rippled, quick and nervous, some guests chuckling too loudly to disguise their discomfort, others covering their mouths as if unsure whether they should join in. The sound spread, polite and poisonous, until it hovered over the table like smoke. Amara did not flinch. She held her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, her expression serene. She did not fire back, did not protest, did not rise to the bait Edward dangled before her. She let the laughter settle, and in her silence there was no submission but strength, a calm that made the sound around her seem cheap and hollow. The quiet dignity with which she carried herself unsettled the table, far more than anger ever could. It forced those who laughed to hear themselves, to feel the ugliness of the moment as it echoed back in the stillness that followed. Slowly the laughter faded, leaving behind an uneasy hush, the clink of a glass, the scrape of a fork, the shuffle of someone adjusting in their chair. Charles cleared his throat, shifting in discomfort, trying to redirect the conversation toward safer ground. Eleanor sipped her wine, her eyes narrowing slightly as though gauging Amara's reaction, waiting for a crack that never came. Vivienne smiled too brightly, eager to smooth over the tension, but the air had already changed, and no amount of brittle charm could erase it. Amara remained composed, her eyes steady, her silence carrying more weight than any words could have managed. Around her the guests avoided her gaze, complicit in their silence, aware that they had witnessed something both cruel and revealing. Edward leaned back, smirk still clinging to his lips, but beneath it, a flicker of unease had begun to show, the first sign that his arrogance had met a strength he did not expect. Vivienne Harrington sat like a jewel on display, her gown a shimmer of pale silk that caught every glimmer from the chandeliers above. She had mastered the art of drawing attention without appearing to reach for it, her posture flawless, her smile polished, her laughter rising at the exact moment it would be noticed. She had been raised to believe she was the standard against which all others were measured, and tonight she carried that belief like a crown. As the courses passed, she leaned across the table toward Amara, her perfume thick in the air, her voice pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear. With a smile that looked kind but carried a blade, she remarked that Amara's emerald gown was almost lovely, though it looked like something from a second-season collection, perhaps chosen because it was timeless rather than current. Her tone was sugar, but the message was sharp, the kind of remark designed to draw chuckles without ever breaking the surface of politeness. A few guests laughed, their voices quick and shallow, eager to align themselves with Vivienne's power. The chuckles slid through the air like glass beads on marble, brittle and false, yet no one at the table questioned the insult hidden beneath the compliment. They were blind to the irony that the woman they mocked, the outsider with the emerald gown, held more power in that moment than the Harrington name could afford to recognize. Amara felt the eyes on her, some curious, some gleeful, waiting for a reaction, waiting to see if she would flinch. But she did not. She smiled, a quiet curve of her lips, and simply nodded as though Vivienne had spoken nothing more than a passing observation. Her calm unsettled the table more than any defense could have. Vivienne sat back, pleased with herself, her brittle smile widening as she sipped her wine. She believed she had reminded the outsider of her place, that she had put a seam between belonging and intrusion, one stitched with fashion and status. Edward smirked beside her, amused at his sister's precision, while Eleanor raised an approving brow, as if this, too, was part of the family ritual, the subtle testing of those who dared enter their circle. Charles said nothing, choosing instead to let the moment pass. Though his silence was not neutral, it was permission. Around the table the energy shifted, the laughter fading into a hum of small talk, yet beneath it there was an unease, a sense that something had cracked in the polished surface. Amara did not let the moment touch her. She lifted her glass, her fingers steady, her gaze sweeping the table with quiet confidence. She wore the gown not as armor, but as an extension of herself, and in that emerald fabric, simple yet commanding, she looked like she belonged not only in the room, but above it. Her silence spoke louder than Vivienne's whisper, for it forced the others to see the imbalance, the cruelty wrapped in silk, the arrogance paraded as wit. Those who laughed began to feel the weight of their own complicity, though none dared admit it aloud. The insult hung in the air, brittle and sharp, yet in Amara's calm it lost its power, reduced to a shallow ripple against the deep water of her composure. The dinner moved forward with the rhythm of clinking silver and murmured conversations. But beneath the polished surface, the tension at the Harrington table had thickened. Eleanor Harrington sat at the center like a queen presiding over her court, her midnight gown flowing around her with quiet gravity, her diamonds glowing without sparkle, chosen for their weight rather than their shine. She had spoken little throughout the evening, letting her husband and children perform their parts. But when she did finally raise her glass, the table fell into expectant silence. Her voice was smooth and low, touched with the authority of decades spent commanding attention without ever needing to raise it. She spoke of tradition, of the meaning of the gala, of how the family had always opened its doors to bring the city's finest together. Then, with the faintest curve of a smile, she added that some people should be grateful simply to be invited, because not everyone had the privilege of standing beneath chandeliers built on generations of legacy. The words floated over the table, wrapped in charm, but their sharp edge was undeniable. Eyes flicked toward Amara, quick and cautious, though none lingered long enough to betray complicity. It was a test, spoken with deliberate ambiguity, framed as a general statement, but aimed with precision. Amara felt the insult settle over her like cold glass, yet she did not shift in her seat or lower her gaze. She lifted her glass as well, meeting Eleanor's stare across the polished table, her eyes steady, her posture unbroken. The silence that followed was sharper than any spoken reply, a refusal to bend to the condescension, a strength that spoke louder than protest ever could. Eleanor held her gaze for a moment longer, searching for a crack, but Amara gave her nothing. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who knew her worth, someone who understood that power did not rest in old walls or glittering diamonds, but in the ability to remain unshaken when provoked. The quiet dignity unsettled the table more than anger might have. Those who had laughed at Edward's joke or chuckled at Vivienne's whisper now looked down at their plates, the weight of complicity pressing heavier with each second of silence. Even Charles, who had perfected the art of moving past discomfort, cleared his throat and gestured for the next course to arrive, eager to dissolve the tension his wife had sharpened. Eleanor lowered her glass slowly, her expression unchanged, though behind her polished mask there was calculation. She had tested Amara, expecting to find a weakness, expecting to watch her falter or defend herself, and in doing so reveal insecurity. Instead, she found only calm, an unyielding poise that matched her own. The matriarch turned back to her plate, her smile returning as if the exchange had been no more than a passing remark, but those seated nearby had felt the duel. Amara's silence had been louder than words, her composure heavier than diamonds. The conversation resumed, laughter forced back into the air, but the moment lingered, a fracture in the smooth surface of the evening. Amara had absorbed the insult and returned it not with anger, but with something stronger, a steady silence that stripped the remark of its power. In a room built on appearances, her calm refusal to break had become the most powerful statement of all. When the dinner plates were cleared and the music swelled once more through the ballroom, Charles Harrington placed a hand lightly on Amara's arm, his touch both courteous and commanding. With a smile that seemed carved rather than genuine, he steered her away from the table and toward a quieter alcove near the tall windows that looked out over the city skyline. His tone was smooth, almost paternal, the kind of voice he used when speaking to mayors and governors he wished to charm. But beneath it lay the faint echo of superiority, as though every word was meant to remind her that this was his house, his gala, his world. He began by praising her resilience, calling her composed, then let his voice drop into something meant to be confidential. He told her she must not take things too personally, for people sometimes let their words run too freely in a room filled with champagne and tradition. His smile deepened, polished as glass, and he added that partnership with the Harrington family meant learning to accept certain old-world ways, because heritage was not easily changed, and sometimes it was better to allow small things to pass rather than dwell on them. Amara listened, without interrupting, her eyes on the glittering city lights beyond the glass. Her expression, calm. She knew what he meant, though he wrapped it in velvet. He was telling her to endure the condescension, to bend quietly to the arrogance of his family, to treat insult as the price of entry into their circle. His words were not an apology but a dismissal, an attempt to soften humiliation with charm while expecting her silence in return. She turned her gaze back to him, her face unreadable, and inclined her head slightly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, a gesture that gave him nothing yet took nothing. Charles spoke on, his tone steady, suggesting that great families carried their own customs, that strength sometimes looked like patience, that progress was slow, and required understanding from those who entered their world. He framed his advice as wisdom, yet every phrase reinforced the same unspoken truth. He saw her not as an equal, but as someone who must adapt to them, not the other way around. His voice carried the weight of a man who had shaped deals worth billions, who believed influence was his birthright, who could not imagine his empire bending to meet anyone else. Amara's silence unsettled him more than protest would have. He searched her expression for softness, for gratitude, for the flicker of concession that always came when he pressed his weight against others. Yet she gave him only composure, a quiet stillness that revealed nothing and promised everything. When at last she smiled, it was small, steady, and it left him uncertain whether he had reassured her or revealed more of himself than he intended. He patted her arm once more, called her remarkable, and excused himself to greet another guest. Amara remained by the window for a moment, her eyes once again on the city, the lights sharp against the night. She absorbed his words, but she did not bend beneath them. The mask of civility he wore had slipped just enough for her to see the truth, and she carried it with her, like a stone polished smooth by time. The night air was cooler on the balcony, carrying with it the faint hum of the city far below, a reminder that beyond chandeliers and marble floors, real lives unfolded in quiet apartments and crowded streets. Amara stepped into the stillness, grateful for the space, the buzz of laughter, and the scrape of silver behind her, fading like a distant echo. She pulled her phone from the small clutch at her side, the emerald fabric of her gown brushing against the stone railing, and her fingers moved with steady precision. She typed a short message to her COO, asking for the final valuation reports, her tone clipped and professional, a sharp contrast to the false warmth she had just endured from Charles Harrington. The reply came within minutes, numbers spilling across the glowing screen in neat columns, percentages and valuations condensed into the language of power that she knew better than anyone at the gala. She studied them carefully, her eyes scanning the figures with the calm focus of someone who had built her empire, not on inheritance, but on accuracy and grit. The numbers told her everything she already suspected. The Harrington family needed her deal more than she needed theirs. Their hospitality division was slipping, their luxury assets strained beneath the weight of modern competition, their relevance fading in markets that demanded innovation. The renewable project she had designed could be their salvation, a chance to rebrand as forward-thinking, to position themselves in a future that would not wait for them. Without her, they were trapped in marble halls and old chandeliers, clinging to past glory while the world moved on. Amara's thumb hovered over the screen as she reread the data, her mind calm, her resolve sharpening. She had walked into this evening expecting arrogance, but the weight of it had still pressed heavy. The cutting jokes, the brittle smiles, the veiled insults dressed as tradition. Yet here, under the open night, she felt the balance shift. They believed they were testing her, but the truth was that she was testing them, and they were failing with every passing hour. Their world was one of appearances, but hers was one of substance, built on numbers that did not lie, on technology that worked, on people who trusted her because she had earned it. She slipped the phone back into her clutch and drew a slow breath. her eyes sweeping over the lights of the city stretched beneath her like a sea of gold. Each light was a window, a story, a reminder of where she had come from. The narrow streets of Detroit, the nights of doubt, the weight of bills that never seemed to end. She thought of her mother's voice telling her dignity was discipline, her grandmother's steady hand guiding her through storms. That strength was with her now, steadying her heart as she turned back toward the ballroom. The Harringtons thought she needed their name, but the truth glowed as clear as the lights below. It was they who needed her, and by the end of this night she would make sure they understood it. The hum of the ballroom returned as Amara stepped back inside. The warm glow of chandeliers spilling across polished marble, the laughter and music rising in waves. She moved through the crowd with the same steady grace she had carried all evening, though her resolve now burned brighter beneath her calm surface. Near the long table where wineglasses glimmered like jewels, she paused, her attention caught by Edward's voice. He stood with a cluster of bankers and politicians, his glass of scotch raised high, his smirk stretched wide. He spoke loudly, the way men do when they believe the room belongs to them, and he was holding court with the arrogance of an heir certain of his place. Edward described the expansion of what he called the Johnson Project, his words dripping with entitlement. He spoke of renewable facilities, of international markets, of billions in long-term revenue streams, each phrase falling from his mouth as though the ideas had been born in the Harrington boardroom, rather than in the sleepless nights Amara had spent building her company from scratch. The men around him nodded with approval, their laughter rumbling as he painted a future that he presented as his own triumph. They barely looked at her, though she stood only a few steps away, their glances sliding past her as if she were invisible, as if the architect of the project was no more than a shadow in the room. Vivienne leaned in beside her brother, her brittle smile flashing, as she added that the Harrington name would soon be linked with the green energy revolution, as though it were a prize they had chosen to collect, rather than a partnership still unsealed. Eleanor drifted near, her diamonds catching the light, her gaze cool, her silence signaling approval of the performance. Charles laughed with his guests, not correcting his son, not acknowledging the woman who had built the empire they were claiming. It was a tableau of entitlement, a family rehearsing their victory before the ink had even touched the page. Amara watched, her face composed, her eyes steady, her silence once again her weapon. Inside her, the numbers she had read on the balcony beat like a second pulse, reminding her that their survival depended on her, that the billion-dollar project was hers to grant or deny. She let their words wash over her, each one stripping away the last traces of patience. They assumed ownership of her vision without ever granting her humanity. They toasted profits while erasing her name. They spoke of her as though she were not standing at their side but somewhere beneath them, faceless, voiceless, expendable. Yet their blindness gave her strength. She did not need their recognition to know her worth, and she did not need their approval to claim her power. As Edward raised his glass again, boasting that the family would lead the future of clean energy, Amara turned slightly, her emerald gown catching the light, her profile illuminated against the chandeliers. She knew then that the turning point had arrived. They believed they owned what she built, but soon they would learn that the future could not be stolen with a smirk and a toast. It had to be earned, and she was the one who held it in her hands. The auction had carried on with the rhythm of polite applause and raised paddles, priceless art, and glittering jewels, changing hands as smoothly as the champagne that flowed through the ballroom. The string quartet played with delicate precision, the hum of wealth filling the air like perfume, and the Harringtons basked in their familiar glow of admiration. When the bidding paused, Charles Harrington rose from his place at the front, with a smile that had been rehearsed countless times in mirrors and boardrooms. He tapped the microphone lightly, his voice carrying over the crowd with the practiced warmth of a man who knew how to own a room. He spoke of the family legacy, of charity, of vision, and then with a flourish, he gestured toward Amara, inviting her forward as though presenting an exhibit rather than a partner. His words framed her as proof of the family's progressive spirit, a symbol they could display to show the world they embraced innovation and diversity, a trophy to polish their fading empire. The guests applauded politely, their eyes turning toward Amara, as she stood, her emerald gown gleaming under the chandeliers. She moved with calm steps to the front of the room, her posture tall, her expression serene, her heart steady with resolve. Charles extended the microphone with a confident smile, certain she would deliver a few gracious words of thanks, a performance that would fold neatly into the image he wished to project. Instead, she accepted it with hands that did not tremble, her voice smooth as silk as she began to speak. She thanked the crowd for their attention, her words simple but measured, each one carrying weight. She spoke of innovation, of building futures from the ground up, of the importance of dignity and respect in every partnership. Her eyes swept the room, steady and unflinching, and the murmurs faded into silence. Then her tone shifted, still calm, still poised, but sharper, as she acknowledged the hospitality she had received that evening, hospitality wrapped in laughter that cut and smiles that judged. She spoke of whispers that mocked and remarks that belittled. And though she never named a single person, the air grew heavy, for everyone at the table knew exactly who she meant. Her voice did not rise, it did not need to. The silence of the ballroom carried her words further than volume ever could. The crowd shifted uneasily, glasses lowered, eyes darting, but Amara did not falter. She spoke of legacy not as a shield for arrogance, but as a responsibility to honor those who entered the room, no matter where they came from or how they spoke. Her words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading across faces that had been polished into masks. She paused, let the silence grow, then concluded with a simple truth, that the future could not be built on condescension, that true partnership required respect, and without it no deal, no matter the size, could stand. She handed the microphone back with a calm smile, her poise unshaken, while Charles stood frozen beside her, his expression brittle under the golden light. The applause that followed was uncertain, scattered at first, then rising slowly, not for the Harringtons but for the woman who had spoken with quiet courage. Amara stepped down, her emerald gown sweeping the floor, and in that moment, the room no longer belonged to the family who had built it. It belonged to her. Amara let the weight of the microphone settle in her hand, her eyes sweeping across the ballroom, as though she could see through every mask and every polished smile. She began softly, thanking the guests for their hospitality, acknowledging the effort of the evening, the music, the fine wine, the glittering auction. Her tone was gracious but steady, her words measured so carefully that at first the room leaned in, expecting the usual courtesy of polite thanks. But as her voice grew firmer, the air shifted, and what had begun as gratitude unfolded into truth. She spoke of the evening not only as a guest, but as a witness, describing how laughter can sting when aimed like a blade, how compliments wrapped in disdain reveal more about the speaker than the subject, how silence from those who know better becomes a second insult of its own. The glasses froze halfway to lips, the hands holding them rigid as the meaning of her words spread through the marble hall. The quartet faltered for just a moment before continuing, though their notes sounded smaller now, almost fragile beneath her voice. Amara did not raise her tone. She did not need to. The stillness of the crowd carried her words further than volume ever could. She spoke of dignity, of the unshakable truth that respect is not a gift given by old names, but a responsibility shared by all who stand in the same room. She reminded them that legacy without honor is nothing more than dust covered in jewels, and that arrogance costs more than money. It costs trust, it costs humanity, it costs the very foundation upon which power pretends to stand. A murmur ran through the crowd, quickly silenced by the clarity of her gaze. She recounted with precision the moments that had marked the night, a joke about where she was from, a whisper about her gown, a remark about being grateful simply to be present. She did not name Edward, Vivienne, or Eleanor, but her restraint only sharpened the blade of her words, for every guest at the table knew who had spoken, and every guest in the room understood. She spoke not as a victim, but as a woman who knew her worth, a leader who had built her empire without chandeliers or marble floors, a partner who would never trade respect for profit. The silence was absolute now, the sound of the city outside muffled by thick glass, the clink of silver hushed, the laughter extinguished. Amara paused, letting the weight of truth settle across the room. Then she finished with a single statement, that progress built on arrogance is no progress at all, and that dignity must be the cornerstone of any partnership worth building. She handed back the microphone with calm precision, her emerald gown catching the light as she stepped away. The room remained suspended, glasses still frozen in mid-air, every guest caught between admiration and shame. In that stillness, Amara's words echoed louder than applause, and the Harringtons, for the first time, looked small beneath their own chandeliers. The ballroom was still vibrating with the echo of Amara's words when she lifted her chin and let her gaze travel across the crowd, her expression calm, though her voice carried the weight of finality. She thanked them once more, her tone gracious. But then, with a clarity that sliced through the air like glass, she announced that her company would not be moving forward with the proposed joint venture with Harrington Holdings. She explained that partnership could only stand on respect, and respect had not been shown, not tonight, and not in the tone of those who believed legacy excused arrogance. Her words were simple, stripped of flourish, but the effect was devastating. The sound of $1 billion vanishing in the space of a breath. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The chandeliers seemed to burn brighter, the violins faltered, glasses were frozen halfway to lips, the air itself tightening as if the room had forgotten how to breathe. The silence that followed struck harder than any slap, heavier than any outburst could have been. Guests turned their heads, eyes darting between Amara and the Harrington family, waiting for someone to speak, but none of them did. Edward's smirk collapsed into disbelief. Vivian's brittle smile cracked into shock. Eleanor's jeweled hand stiffened around her glass, and Charles himself sat rooted in place, his practiced mask slipping as the truth of her words cut deeper than he could deflect. Amara remained steady, her posture regal in its quiet strength, her emerald gown aflame against the marble glow. She had not raised her voice. She had not flung accusations, but she had ended the conversation with finality. Around the room, whispers began to stir, hushed at first, then louder, rippling through the guests like a storm building momentum. Donors leaned to one another with wide eyes. Investors shifted in their seats, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The Harrington Gala, meant to be another display of power, had become the stage of their greatest humiliation, and it had been orchestrated not by rivals or scandals, but by the calm refusal of a woman they had dismissed as an outsider. Charles finally rose, his voice cracking as he attempted to salvage dignity, insisting that misunderstandings could be smoothed, that emotion sometimes clouded judgment, but his words fell flat, swallowed by the silence that still pressed heavy on the room. No one applauded, no one stepped in to rescue him, and for the first time in decades, the patriarch of the Harrington Empire looked small, his authority stripped bare, under the glare of chandeliers that had once seemed his crown. Amara handed the microphone back, with a polite nod, her expression unchanged, and stepped down with the same calm grace she had carried all evening. She did not need to linger. Her message had already settled deep into every corner of the room. The billion-dollar deal was gone, erased not with signatures, but with dignity, and as she walked away, the silence followed her like a shadow, leaving the Harrington family to sit beneath their chandeliers and feel the weight of what they had lost. Edward was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice rising with the uneven pitch of a man who had never been told no in public. He sputtered about contracts and obligations, his words tumbling over each other, but the more he spoke, the smaller he sounded. His face flushed crimson, his glass shaking in his hand, as he insisted that Amara was being unreasonable, that she did not understand how things were done. Across from him, Vivienne sat rigid, her usual smile gone, her skin pale under the glow of the chandeliers. She tried to laugh, a thin, brittle sound, but it died quickly in her throat when she noticed the way the guests were watching, their expressions cool, their eyes shifting away. Charles rose to his feet, his booming voice filling the space as he attempted to seize control of the moment. He spoke of generosity, of tradition, of how the Harrington name had carried the city for generations. He blustered about misunderstandings, about emotions running high. His tone meant to smooth, but each word landed hollow, falling into the heavy air and dissolving before they could carry weight. Eleanor leaned close to him, her whisper sharp as a blade, warning of overreaction, of the dangers of letting an outsider dictate the family's image. Her voice hissed through her clenched teeth, her jeweled hand gripping the stem of her glass as if it were a lifeline. Around them the crowd shifted, the subtle choreography of power rearranging itself in real time. Donors who once leaned eagerly toward the Harringtons now began to edge away, their chairs sliding back slightly, their bodies angling toward other conversations. Executives exchanged looks, murmured to their assistants, and moved discreetly toward the far side of the ballroom where Amara stood, her calm figure radiant in emerald against the marble backdrop. The shift was quiet but undeniable, as visible as the tide pulling away from shore. For years the Harringtons had been the center of gravity in this room, but now that gravity had weakened, and people were already searching for a new star to orbit, Edward raged under his breath, his jaw tight, his eyes flashing with humiliation. Vivienne tried to regain composure, smoothing her gown, lifting her chin, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her. Charles pressed on with his speech, louder now, almost desperate, promising that the family's vision was still strong, that the billion-dollar future was secure. But the guests were no longer listening. Eleanor's eyes flicked across the crowd, sharp and calculating, and for the first time in decades, she felt the sting of something unfamiliar, the weight of disapproval she could not control. Amara did not need to speak further. Her silence was more commanding than their noise. She stood at a distance, serene, speaking quietly to one or two guests, who approached her with respect, her poise untouched by the storm unraveling behind her. The Harringtons had always believed reputation was unshakable, carved in marble like the pillars of their ballroom, but in a single evening the cracks were visible, spreading fast, and no amount of bluster could seal them. What they had mocked, they now feared, and what they had dismissed, they now chased. The aftershock rolled on, shifting the very ground beneath their gilded table. Amara stood near the edge of the ballroom, where the air felt lighter, her hands resting gently at her sides, her emerald gown still gleaming under the chandeliers, though the storm of the evening had tried to dim it. She spoke quietly with a woman from the Arts Council, her voice calm, her expression serene, and though she had just canceled a billion-dollar deal, her presence radiated certainty. The Harrington family continued to flounder at their table, Edward red-faced and restless, Vivienne pale and brittle, Charles thundering about tradition, Eleanor whispering sharp corrections, but the power they once commanded was slipping like sand through glass. Eyes that once clung to them now drifted elsewhere, searching for a steadier anchor. Through the shifting crowd, a younger investor made his way toward Amara, his movements discreet but purposeful. He was in his early 30s, sharp but not yet hardened by the arrogance that clung to older men in the room, his dark suit simple, his tie slightly loosened, as if he were more interested in substance than performance. He paused a few steps away, waiting for the conversation to end, then approached her with a respectful nod, lowering his voice so as not to draw too much attention. He told her he admired her composure, that her words had carried more weight than any speech he had ever heard in that ballroom, and that dignity of that kind was rare in business. Amara thanked him softly, her gaze steady, not flattered but open, and he leaned a little closer, explaining that while others might be rattled by her decision, he saw it differently. He said that doors often close loudly but new ones open quietly, and he believed there was space to discuss alternative partnerships, ones that did not rely on old names and brittle traditions. His tone was practical, his admiration sincere, and in his eyes there was no trace of condescension, only respect for the woman who had stood against an entire family and not wavered. She listened carefully, measuring his words as she had measured so many numbers before, and though she gave no promises, she let him know she was willing to talk. The conversation was brief, discreet, but it was enough to signal the shift already taking shape. Across the ballroom, others noticed, though they pretended not to watch. Two executives whispered to each other near the wine table. Another donor slipped away from the Harrington circle and lingered near Amara's side, and in the hush of the room, it was clear that alliances were already realigning. The young investor excused himself with a polite nod, promising to send a message the next day, and as he walked back into the crowd, Amara felt the truth settle deeper within her. What she had lost in spectacle, she had gained in substance, and what had seemed like a slammed door was in fact a passage to something greater. The Harringtons had mocked her, dismissed her, tried to parade her as decoration, but she had turned their stage into her platform. Quietly, discreetly, the future was shifting toward her, and the night that was meant to humiliate her had instead revealed her power. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers until the final guest drifted out, but the echoes of Amara's words lingered longer than the music or the taste of champagne. Reporters who had been invited to cover the auction for its charitable sheen had captured every moment, their cameras sharp, their microphones discreet, but always ready. They had filmed Edward's sneer, Vivian's brittle smile, Eleanor's raised brow, and Charles's blustering attempts to reclaim control. They had recorded Amara's calm voice recounting the evening's insults, and they had preserved forever the moment she announced that the billion-dollar deal with Harrington Holdings was over. The Harrington family had tried to smooth the edges, but their flustered faces told a clearer story than their words ever could. By the time the chandeliers dimmed, the tale was already leaving the marble walls, carried on phone screens and whispered calls, moving faster than any of them could contain. When dawn touched the skyline, the story was everywhere. Headlines flashed across business outlets and news channels with a clarity that made Charles's stomach tighten. CEO walks away from 1B deal after Gala insult. Some papers used softer words, others sharper ones, but all told the same story: the empire of old money humbled by a single evening of arrogance. Photographs showed Amara in her emerald gown, steady and composed, while the Harringtons were caught mid-expression, Edward's smirk frozen in cruelty, Vivian's laugh sharpened into disdain, Eleanor's stare unreadable but cold, Charles's mouth open in protest. Side by side, the images told the truth. Without commentary, markets opened with unease, and for the first time in years, the Harrington name did not inspire steady confidence. Stock in Harrington Holdings dipped by mid-morning, a decline that might have seemed modest to outsiders, but was seismic in its implication. Investors whispered about arrogance, about shifting power, about the danger of tying wealth to legacy rather than innovation. Emails flooded in, donors and partners asking questions they once would not have dared to ask, some discreetly stepping back, others openly rethinking their commitments. What had once been untouchable was now vulnerable, and the fracture was spreading. Amara watched it all from her office, her phone lighting with calls from journalists eager for comment, her inbox heavy with messages from potential partners who had seen her strength and wanted to align with it. She responded to few, choosing her words with care, but she allowed the headlines to do the work for her. The humiliation was not hers. It belonged to those who had laughed at her accent, sneered at her gown, and expected her silence. She had walked away without raising her voice, and in doing so, she had revealed the brittle foundation beneath their marble halls. By noon, the narrative was set. The Harrington Empire, shaken not by markets or competition, but by their own arrogance, exposed beneath their chandeliers and their brittle charm. For years they had paraded their power as eternal, but now the world had seen how easily it cracked. And at the center of it all stood Amara Johnson, steady, unbroken, and more powerful than ever before. Amara moved toward the exit, with the same calm composure she had carried since the first moment she entered the ballroom. Her steps measured, her posture tall, her emerald gown shimmering as it caught the light from the chandeliers one final time. The crowd parted for her, as if instinctively, their gazes following her with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Some whispered to one another, some remained silent, but all of them understood that the night had shifted, that the balance of power had been rewritten before their eyes. She had not shouted, she had not demanded, she had not pleaded, she had simply spoken with dignity and then walked away, leaving the Harrington family exposed beneath the glitter they thought would shield them forever. Behind her, the Harringtons sat frozen, their table a portrait of unraveling pride. Edward's lips moved in protest, but no sound carried. His earlier arrogance shrunk to something smaller, more fragile. Vivienne clutched the edge of her chair, her brittle smile gone, her face pale, as if she could not comprehend that her cutting words had lost all meaning. Eleanor's jewels gleamed coldly, her hand tense around her glass, her eyes narrowed not with triumph, but with calculation that had failed her. Charles remained upright, shoulders squared, but the bluster had drained from him, and though he tried to meet the eyes of those still watching, he found no anchor, only faces that turned away. For decades they had defined evenings like this, but now their empire looked like an echo, a hollow performance stripped of its illusion. Amara reached the grand doors and paused for a moment, not to look back in hesitation but to let the image settle, to mark it in the minds of every guest who would recall this night for years. The emerald gown caught the last golden sweep of the chandeliers, and in that glow she appeared untouchable, not a guest, not an outsider, but the axis around which the room had turned. Then she stepped forward, her heels striking the marble with a sound sharper than applause, each step carrying her beyond their grasp. The silence that followed was not emptiness but weight, a silence that told the truth, louder than the music or speeches ever could. The Harrington family had mocked her, dismissed her, tried to parade her as proof of their relevance, but in the end, it was her strength that defined the night. She had arrived as the guest they underestimated, and left as the figure who redefined them. Whispers rose again, softer this time, not cruel but reverent, and in those whispers, her name carried more power than theirs had in generations. The doors closed behind her with quiet finality, and the ballroom seemed dimmer without her presence, as though the chandeliers had lost some of their fire. The Harringtons remained seated, stunned into stillness, while the guests drifted away, their loyalties already shifting toward the future. Amara walked into the night unshaken, her grace intact, and the city itself seemed to gleam in response. The woman they mocked had defined the night, and the balance of power would never be the same again. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.